Going live?
We're live.
We're live. All right.
All right. So
for those of us who were just on that last live, we're actually going to roll back and do it again.
We're going to do it again.
Our voices came out like robots, and we can't have that. That's like, in fact, it's sort of the antithesis of what we're combating here.
Oh, yeah.
Not being robots, and so we sound like robots. So anyways, without any further ado.
So today's topic is about how to connect virtually with the people that we're working with our clients, our colleagues, our supervisors, our coworkers, right? And earlier this week, we put out a video about how to check in on our coworkers in terms of the projects, in terms of, their progress on different work, and that kind of thing, right? So more of the professional side of our interactions with our colleagues. But that's not just, that's not the only important thing with our interactions with our coworkers. We also need to bring in that more human element to our social interaction that has now really is taking place through the remote work scenario, right? And with our digital communications, with our email, our Zoom calls, our Slack, cell phone, calls, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's becoming increasingly relevant, not because in-person interactions are disappearing, but because the working from home, working remotely, these types of work environments are becoming more common. And if you look at what a lot of companies are saying, part of this process has helped them realize that in a lot of roles, the work from home setup is actually most efficient for everyone involved.
Exactly.
So recognizing that, it's important that we learn and equip ourselves with ways to communicate digitally, not just in an effective professional capacity, but also as humans, right? Because when you are communicating in person,
right,
there are a lot of things that happen automatically that we take for granted, right? We consider our in-person communications as high resolution communication, right? High fidelity, because you have so much more information, right? There's a clear picture of their facial expressions.
The micro expressions.
Tone of voice, right? There's just so much more you have to work with, their body language, and you're seeing it all right there. Whereas if you're on a Zoom call, the view might be pixelated, the sound might be distorted. There are way fewer opportunities to really sort of detect what the person is feeling and what they're trying to communicate beyond their words.
Right.
And that it gets further compounded if you're using something like a phone or email,
exactly,
or a chat app,
where we're actually missing out on those nonverbal cues
right,
that we rely so heavily upon when we can see the person.
Exactly,
right?
And so for this reason, it's very important when we switch to digital channels that we humanize those communications, right? We want to make those as rich and meaningful as an in-person interaction would have been. So that's sort of the goal of this conversation.
Right. And if we think about it, there's a lot of sort of perfunctory kind of exchanges that go on. This is a perfect opportunity to, tone it down with those perfunctory exchanges, because it's not like we're going to be sitting at our computer all day just talking to the same person, right? You might be sitting at your computer all day, but you're going to be in and out of different meetings. You're going to be, doing emails, other projects, different work, right? So we're going to eliminate the perfunctory and really come in with the more substantial type of exchanges. So one way to do that is through maintaining this or adopting this openness. And this is something that, psychologists actually talk about in the context of when people are having a really tough time. In that when you're the person who is interacting with someone going through a difficult time, and I think we can all attest that these are challenging times right now.
In many ways.
In many ways, and for different people in different ways. But we can all commiserate knowing that this is how it is for a lot of people. The openness that comes in is really about not being judgmental. It's having an open heart and an open mind when you're being receptive to what people are expressing to you. And maybe you having to go out a little bit on a limb and probing them if you notice something is just awry or is totally off, right? So
even a little bit off.
Or a little bit off, right?
Yeah.
So it's this openness that it's important to sort of now turn that switch on, right? Especially with these remote interactions. And it's also so having an open mind, an open heart, not being judgmental, and the sense of acknowledging the person.
Right, and I think the acknowledgement is a big part of this, right? When we talk about being open, it isn't that, the conversation should be dominated by our personal lives and what's going on sort of behind the scenes. It's simply more so about the last word you use, acknowledgement, right? Acknowledging that the other person is there, acknowledging that, they have a life in addition to work, as do you, and finding ways to tap into that just a little bit, enough that you establish this understanding between the two of you.
Exactly.
Where, if you can be, a little bit open about something personal, it sets a nice foundation for the rest of the conversation.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It establishes a rapport.
Exactly.
That you can leverage to have a clear conversation and productive conversation about whatever it is professionally that you wanted to discuss.
Right, and it really comes down to, on the other side of acknowledging, the validating that happens when you acknowledge. A lot of times, people, I'm actually reading this book right now called Option B with co-written by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant. And it's really good if you want to look at the ways in which we can overcome insurmountable obstacles, build resilience, find joy, this kind of thing in the face of adversity. So I highly recommend it.
And they have some experience with that.
That is very true.
These are one's an executive of Facebook, and the other is a decorated Wharton professor.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't take his course when you were at Wharton.
It's hard to get in.
Yeah,
it's hard to get
true.
in. Adam Grant, he was already a celebrity when I was there. So I experienced it vicariously. And he would do talks.
Of course, yeah. Anyway, not to digress, but definitely check out that book, Option B, if this is something that you're interested in. And so one of the takeaways is this openness that we should sort of, start adopting with our social interactions, especially in the remote context because of the lack of that, right? When we're on a screen, you can't really sense what's going on unless somebody verbalizes it. And then when they do verbalize it, it's your job then to, because you're practicing active listening, which we talk a lot about on this channel, then you are acknowledging. And that's something that people really, like, it feels so good when somebody acknowledges, Acknowledges. It sounds so weird. Acknowledges your feelings because they're validated, right? Your feelings, your struggles are then validated. So that's a big first one.
I like that. And that two-part process is also, I think, very powerful because being open is a little bit like putting your, sticking out a limb.
Exposing yourself.
Yeah, exposing yourself. It takes courage. And when you put yourself out like that, it's very comforting to have the person then receive what it is you're putting out there. Right. That's that acknowledgement. I'm having trouble with that.
It's such a weird word when you say it. There's some words in English when you repeat again and again. It's just
more
like,
and more
is
confusing.
this really a word?
Totally. But by acknowledging that openness, it validates their decision to put it out there. And again, it establishes this trust, this link.
So important.
That sets a great foundation for the rest of the conversation.
Exactly. And then for future interactions as well.
Yeah.
So the openness is the first big one. And then the second thing, in terms of humanizing our interactions, building rapport, maintaining trust, all of the good stuff that comes with human connectivity, of course, is to ask questions. And again, this is something that is brought up in the Option B book. And this is something that sort of surprised me in that there is a lot of people, so a lot of people actually want people to ask them questions in the context of when they're struggling, when they might be, overcoming an obstacle, that kind of thing. They want people to ask them how they're feeling and how it's going and how they overcame that or how they're experiencing it right now and that kind of thing. Whereas some people might be of the sort of camp that says you shouldn't really ask questions because that's like overstepping, that's being nosy, that's being overly inquisitive or curious. Whereas there's actually research that supports, and also, firsthand accounts from people who say that they've been experiencing just their worlds going upside down. And when they had people to talk to and who asked them questions, that was such a huge relief for them and a really great way of, sort of like overcoming those obstacles.
Right, yeah, I think the friction that we're getting at here is the balance between respecting someone's privacy and showing concern, right? Or just showing care.
Yeah.
I mean, concern is a strong word because it doesn't have to be negative, it can be positive, but showing care, right? And I struggle with this personally because it's hard for me to tell if that person wants to talk more about themselves or doesn't. And you'll hear that in general, people enjoy talking about themselves, and that can be true. But particularly in professional contexts, it can feel awkward for them. It can feel sort of not necessarily a safe place for them to share this stuff. And so there is a certain level of awareness you need to employ when you probe. But at the same time, as you're pointing out, people like to know that the person they're interacting with cares about them as a person, right? We're not just machines. We're not just, tools. One-dimensional sort of input-output. We are, fully dimensional, multidimensional humans who are working and are getting stuff done and, being productive at the same time. We have emotions, we have personal lives and so forth. So by generating a touch point where you're making a connection with them and doing so through questions that show you care about what's going on beyond the scope of the project, the professional context, that is it's an important way of establishing rapport, and it can be done in a way that doesn't come across as nosy, right?
Exactly. So one thing that you brought up was this question of, when do I ask those questions? How do I know to ask those questions? And believe it or not, if we're paying attention, if we're really listening fully, right, to not only what they're saying, but how they're saying it, what their expressions look like, and even through a Zoom call, you can see a little bit of that. The big thing here is to pick up on like how many times they start to reference something.
Right.
Right. So, if someone's talking about struggles that they're having with their toddler, and they bring up multiple times that their toddler had surgery, that might be something that you kindly, conscientiously, inquire about, because clearly that's something that they want to talk about.
And that's a perfect example of a tricky situation, right? Because, so a family member has had surgery. That's a very personal topic with a lot of emotions around it, right? Is that something you want to delve into? If it comes up very briefly and in a very vague way, maybe you don't. But if the person, in your case, brings it up multiple times, that's probably them signaling that they want you to ask. They want to get it off their chest. Maybe it's been an emotional weight for them.
Right.
And so by sharing it with someone else, it relieves the burden from them, right? So that's what we talk about. there's not a one-size-fits-all formula here.
Right.
It's much more about being an active listener and determining, based on the cues that they're giving, the social cues that they're emitting, whether it makes sense to probe or whether it makes sense to,
change topics.
change topics or have a light touch.
Right.
And that the only way to tell for sure is to know the person and trust your gut, right?
Yeah.
Our minds are sort of built to understand the cues that other people are giving us. And some people are better at than others, but it is absolutely a skill that you can train. And a lot of what the content that we discuss has to do with is these skills, right? The skills of developing that awareness about whether this is the right time to do this or not.
Timing is they say timing is everything. And it is kind of true, right?
Yeah.
You might not broach that specific topic right from the get-go, right? You might give it some time in terms of like what to do, when to say something, and how to inquire about it, right? So there's that nuance, and it's this delicate balance of, as you were pointing out, right? Asking the question, but then doing it in a way that's not going to, hurt their feelings or make them feel worse than they had before talking to you.
Yep.
Right? So the first one we had was having this openness, right? And that comes down to active listening, not being judgmental, and then opening, your heart and your mind to what they're saying. And as you pointed out, Greg, it's something, sometimes it's about sharing something that you've been going through.
Yep.
Because if you're sharing something, they're going to be much more likely to also share something. And this could be, just like the frustration about homeschooling kids right now, if that's something. Or maybe your laundry machine is broken and you can't get a repair person to fix it, right? Just anything. It doesn't have to be so big or so small. It's just about expressing that. And then the next thing we had was asking questions, because people really like having that opportunity to be acknowledged and also validated. And then the last thing, in terms of humanizing our interactions, which will come in handy when we are also in person. This is not just for the remote work setting. It's about how to ask, how are you, in the right way, right? And so you might be
So this is
wondering,
almost an offshoot of the second one.
in a way,
yeah.
yeah, I think so. But when we're going through something, when we say, how are you, and we just get the response, fine, thanks, how are you, and you know that that person's not doing well, you know that it's just, like you said it before, a social performance, right? And Irving Goffman talks a lot about...
Who's Irving Goffman?
He, I can't remember if he's a sociologist or an anthropologist, but they're all sort of related.
An expert.
Well, yeah,
in
an expert,
linguistics, yeah.
Exactly. I think a sociologist, anthropologist.
Okay.
Anyway, look him up, Irving Goffman. He talks all about he has several books out, but one of them is about how we play a role when we're interacting. And it's about the performance, the social performance, and that we're actors, on a stage, assuming a role and playing a character. And, there's so much of that is true in terms of, when we interact with people even online, right? We might think that we shouldn't ask, like, I'm in a work setting, so I'm not going to ask about their kids.
Right.
Or about that family member that, had, surgery or whatever, because that's not, what a work, that's not what a professional person does. But that's not actually the case, right? We're talking about this now new reality of the work-life blend that is blending even more these days. And so asking how are you and actually getting a real response is important, maybe now more than ever. So, go ahead.
And it seems like something we're already good at, right? Because we do it all the time. But the real key here is that when you ask someone, how are you? If you use those exact words, you're almost guaranteed to get the generic, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? Right? And there's no real meaning in that. And that's no one's fault. It's just a pattern that we've adopted. And so what we're trying to get at is the importance of getting beyond that. You can ask, how are you? And let's say they respond with, fine, thanks, how are you? That's an opportunity for you to then say, I'm doing all right. What's interesting is, or something I've been struggling with is, or what was really cool was, right, add a little more to it,
depth.
right? More depth.
Yeah.
And by you responding with that, that'll invite them to also start to engage with a little more substance. And so that's I think if they respond with, if you find yourself getting into that sort of cyclical pattern, that's a good way to break out of it. But instead of, at the beginning, instead of asking, how are you? Maybe asking something a little more personal, right? Or a little more specific. Obviously context dependent, but getting beyond the sort of generic formalities is a key to unlocking some of that more substantial conversation. And again, this is a professional context. We're not saying you should have a 10-minute tangential conversation on
laundry
or whatever is ailing the world. But the point here is, by opening the conversation with something personal and doing so through expressing care for the other person, you're essentially, what you're able to do is sort of get on the same frequency with the other person, right? You're getting on the same wavelength. And that's where that term comes from. It's like when you dial a radio, you hear the static on either side, and if you get it just right, suddenly the music's coming through crisp and clear. That's what you're trying to do with this type of communication, right? Mm-hmm. By establishing that rapport and that trust with the other person, that personal connection, you are able to have a much more effective conversation about whatever else it is you're discussing.
Exactly.
Not because the two things are related, but simply because our minds work that way, right? Once we've established this sort of neuro connection with each other, everything else we discuss is just going to make more sense. And that's because that's just the way our brains work.
Yeah, and you'll have more empathy, the next time you broach that topic, or, in terms of maybe if you're the manager and you're assigning different projects to people, you might, think twice about to whom you're assigning it in that moment, right? So it's all of this all these external elements that help inform what's going on internally in that work setting, let's say. Yeah. Right. So it's something to keep in mind. And like you said, you don't have to spend 10, 20 minutes on a call unpacking all the intricacies of, changing diapers or something. I don't know.
You're big onto the kids these days.
I know, right? I feel like, because I feel for the kids right now.
Yeah.
It's
well,
tough.
The families where you're taking care of kids.
And summer is approaching. It's
gotta
tough.
be challenging.
So we have some videos about what to do with kids and different creative activities. Maybe you should check that out if you have some kids at home and or know people. And this might be a great opportunity to share some tips that you learned from Explearning with some other people who have kids.
Yeah.
But the whole idea is to pepper, your interactions with these human elements, to remind ourselves that we are human, we're not machines, and we're not expecting anyone to be a machine and just to smile through it, right? Just grit your teeth and bear it. No, we're humans, we're feeling, we have a lot of emotions, we're complex, our communication is complex. So let's try to relieve everyone a little bit of a burden as best we can. Yeah,
and what you'll discover is that the more human elements you can work into your conversations, professional conversations included, in a digital context, the more enjoyable they'll be, right? We talk a lot about fatigue of Zoom calls, fatigue of digital interfaces. And a lot of that fatigue comes from this challenge of parsing out the information from all the static, right? All the distracting, literally there could be static.
Or figuratively.
But figuratively, right? There's a lot more going on with these digital interfaces, and it's much harder to pay attention to the signal. So by developing ways of establishing this human connection through these digital channels, you're gonna relieve a lot of the cognitive load of comprehension. And it'll make for a much more natural, pleasurable, and efficient, productive conversation. So definitely worth developing these skills. And
for sure. And again, it's not just going to be helpful to you in the context of your digital communications and remote work, but also when we do go back into society and we do experience our face-to-face communication again, you might start, changing the way you ask, how are you? Or you might start changing the way of listening. Right. So these are all really valuable lessons that we can transfer into different communication settings.
Yep. Great. All right. I think that wraps up today.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in. And as always, we look forward to your feedback and comments and things that have worked for you, strategies that work for you, challenges that you encounter on these topics. So by all means, leave your comments, chime in, let us know.
Yeah, we love hearing from you.
Yeah.
So happy Explearning, everyone.
Happy
We'll
Explearning.
see you in the next one.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.